The best camera setup isn't the one with the most number of customized settings. It's the one that almost lets you forget that the camera exists. When an animal suddenly appears in front of you, the last thing you want to be thinking is about your camera menu. Over the last 2 years, I have configured my camera around one simple objective: to get the camera out of my way as much as possible. And to do that, I follow two simple principles. First, minimize the number of decisions I have to make in the field. And second, make the process of making those decisions as fast as possible. So every setting that you will see in this video exists simply because it helps me do one of those two things. And together, they help me stay focused on what really matters, the wildlife in front of me. I am not going to walk you through every setting on my camera, but just the ones that genuinely change the way you shoot. And more importantly, I'll let you know why. Let's begin. Let's start with exposure. I keep it relatively simple. I always shoot in manual mode. That's because I want complete control over two things that define how my photos look: aperture and shutter speed. Aperture controls the depth of field, or simply put, how much of the scene do I want to keep in focus? Do I just want the subject to be sharp? Or do I want the entire scene in focus? Shutter speed, on the other hand, decides whether I can freeze motion or introduce motion blur. See, both of these are creative decisions, and I don't want my camera making them for me. But just because I'm shooting in manual mode doesn't mean I expose manually. In fact, my ISO is always set to auto. Wildlife photography is quite unpredictable. Animals move between sunlight and shade all the time, and the light can frankly change in an instant. So I don't want to be thinking about exposure every few seconds. I want to be watching the animal and focus on my composition. And frankly, this gives me the best of both worlds. While I stay in control of how the image looks, the camera takes care of keeping it properly exposed. Now, one important caveat. If you're a beginner and you are not comfortable shooting in manual mode just yet, that is absolutely okay. Lean on aperture priority or shutter priority while you build your confidence. The goal isn't to force yourself to a very complex exposure mode just because a tutorial said so. It's to get comfortable in handling your camera in the field. So use the automation to your advantage and step up to manual whenever you feel ready. The next setting is white balance. And for wildlife photography, I simply leave it on auto. Modern cameras do an excellent job here. And I can always fine tune the white balance in post processing if I need to. The only time I switch to a fixed white balance is when I'm recording videos, like this one. In a controlled environment, I want every shot to have the same color. So locking the white balance makes a lot of sense. And finally, I shoot raw. I don't record JPEGs at all. Remember, throughout this section, I have deliberately handed a few decisions over to the camera. I'm letting it decide the ISO, in a way the exposure. I am also letting it decide the white balance. And sometimes, despite modern cameras being incredibly good, they don't get these decisions exactly right. And that's where raw files become invaluable. A raw file contains far more information than JPEGs. And that gives me greater flexibility to recover highlights, lift shadows, adjust white balance, or even correct a small exposure mistake that I made or the camera made. Now, raw files aren't magic. It won't rescue a completely blown out image or a photograph that is several stops underexposed. But it gives me enough latitude to confidently automate some of these decisions, knowing that I can fine tune them later if required. And that's really my entire approach to exposure. In practice, I'm only making two decisions in the field: my aperture and my shutter speed. Everything else, ISO, white balance, and to a large extent, the exposure, is being handled by the camera. That frees me up to focus on what matters more: the light, the composition, animal behavior, and the moment itself. Now that exposure is taken care of, let's talk about focus. Once again, my goal is to keep things as simple as possible. I want the camera to do as much of the work as it can so that I can focus on making the photograph. The first setting we need to talk about is the focus mode, and it's a no brainer. Just set it to continuous autofocus or AFC and forget about it. Wildlife is continuously moving. Even when an animal appears to be still, it's usually turning its head, breathing, or maybe taking small steps. Now, autofocus continuously updates focus so that it can account for these movements automatically. This is easily the one setting I never change. Next up is eye tracking, and I leave it on all the time. See, the eye is almost always the most important part of a photograph. If the eye is sharp, the image immediately feels more engaging. And most cameras now are incredibly good at detecting and tracking an animal's eye. So I let the camera handle that while I concentrate on, let's say, composition and timing. The next setting is subject detection selection. And I only enable birds and animals. Everything else is turned off because I simply don't need it. If I am photographing a tiger, I switch to animal. If I am photographing a bird, I switch to bird. That's all I ever use. The next setting that you need to care about is the focus area. My default focus area is a tracking spot medium, and that's what I use for the vast majority of my wildlife photography. It gives a good balance between precision and flexibility. Now, this is also probably the setting that I change the most. Different situations call for different focus areas. And later in this video, I'll show you how I have made switching between them very easy. Also, if you want to learn more about when to use which focus area, I have made a dedicated video on that topic. I'll leave the link in the description. Now, when it comes to the physical act of focusing, which is pressing the button, I use back button focus. Instead of focusing with the shutter button, I focus using the AF on button right here. The shutter button just does one thing. It simply takes the picture. Separating, focusing and shooting gives you much more control. You can track a moving subject, stop focusing whenever you want, and take multiple frames without the camera trying to refocus every time you press the shutter. And setting this up is very simple. Just disable autofocus from the shutter button. On most Sony cameras, the AF on button is already configured for autofocus by default. From that point on, the shutter button only takes the picture, while the AF on button is responsible for focusing. And that's really my entire approach to focusing. Configure it once, trust the camera to do its job, and spend your attention on the wildlife instead of understanding the autofocus system. So far, we've talked about how I expose my images and how I focus. But there's one final piece of the puzzle. See, wildlife is very unpredictable. A tiger can emerge from the bushes without a warning. A bird can take flight in an instant. And when that happens, you don't have time to be digging through your camera menus. So once you've decided on the settings you want to use, the next step is making sure you can access them as quickly as possible. And that's exactly why cameras have custom buttons. They're there to give you instant access to the settings you change the most often. See, the key is to customize them around your workflow so your camera adapts to the way you shoot and not the other way around. Now, the exact buttons and layout I use don't really matter. Most modern cameras allow you to remap pretty much any physical button on the body to almost any setting. It's all about keeping it simple, figuring out which settings you need to change on the fly, and mapping them where your fingers naturally rest. And for my workflow, it comes down to 4 specific adjustments. Let's start with the first one, subject detection. Like I mentioned earlier, I only keep bird and animal enabled, but switching between the two is something I have to do fairly regularly in the field. If, let's say, I'm tracking a tiger, I need the camera to be looking out for mammalian features. But if an eagle suddenly drops onto a branch, I need to instantly shift the camera's focus to an entirely different set of shapes and patterns. And to handle this, I map the switch subject detection function to the C1 button right here on top of the camera. Now with a single press, I can toggle between animal and bird in a split second. No menus, no scrolling, just one click, and I'm ready for the next shot. Next comes focus area, which is easily the setting I alter the most in the field. While tracking spot medium works for the vast majority of situations, nature will constantly throw curveballs at you. For example, if an animal is moving through dense, chaotic undergrowth, you need to switch to a small, precise spot to force the autofocus past the branches and only focus on the animal. To handle these shifts without navigating the menu, I have mapped the focus area menu to the C2 button right next to the shutter. One press pulls up my options instantly. The goal is simple. I never want to lose a definitive moment because I was stuck navigating a menu. The next setting is metering mode. Now, when it comes to metering, there are generally two schools of thought. The first is to constantly switch between different metering modes depending on the lighting in your scene. Maybe you use multi in one situation, spot in another, or center weighted somewhere else. The second approach is to leave the camera in something like a multi, also known as evaluative or matrix, depending on the brand you use, and simply use exposure compensation to achieve the exposure you want. And personally, I fall firmly into the second camp. I leave my camera on multimetering almost all the time. And if I want to make an image brighter or darker, I simply dial in an exposure compensation. I find this approach to be much faster and much more intuitive in the field. That said, I still have metering mode selection assigned to this delete button. See, every once in a while, you will run into a really tricky lighting situation where spot metering can be incredibly useful. And when that happens, I want to be able to switch to it instantly. So for me, it's not a setting I use every day. It's more of a failsafe that's there when I need it. But if you are someone who prefers switching metering modes regularly, then absolutely assign this to one of your custom buttons. The final piece is exposure compensation, and this is one setting I use constantly. Because my ISO is set to auto, the camera is technically deciding the exposure for me. But the camera doesn't always see the scene the way I want to look at it. And that's why I assign exposure compensation directly to the control wheel right next to the screen. When I press the bottom of this wheel, the scale pops up instantly. I can roll it up or down without taking my eye away from the viewfinder, adjusting the exposure in real time while staying completely locked onto the animal. Now, one thing I don't use is the dedicated exposure compensation dial on my camera, this one right here. I just leave it at 0 and forget about it. In my experience, these dials are notorious for getting knocked accidentally. They're also slower to use because you have to unlock them before making any adjustment. In the field where every second matters, that's just not practical. So those are all my custom button assignments. They reduce the time between seeing a moment and capturing it. And in wildlife photography, those few seconds often make the difference between getting the shot and missing it. Now, before we conclude, there are two more settings that you should pay close attention to. The first is switching to an electronic shutter if your camera allows. See, in wildlife photography, silence is a necessity. A loud mechanical click can instantly startle a shy animal or ruin a natural moment. And electronic shutters are also great for your hardware. Because there are no physical parts constantly snapping open and close, you drastically reduce the mechanical wear and tear over time. Second is your drive mode. See, if storage isn't a concern for you and you're okay with culling a lot of images in post processing, use higher burst speeds. Trust me, it's worth the extra effort of sitting in front of a computer screen and culling those images, because having that speed is absolutely essential when you need to capture split second action in the field. I usually shoot at around 20 frames per second, and that works just fine for me. Alright, that's pretty much about it. If you've been following along, you might have noticed something. I haven't shown you every single menu option on my camera. And that is entirely intentional. Modern cameras have hundreds of parameters that you can tweak, of course. But in reality, only a handful of them have a meaningful impact on how you actually photograph wildlife. Everything else, in my opinion, is just noise. Could you spend hours obsessing over obscure display options or deep autofocus micro adjustments? Absolutely. But I sincerely believe that if a setting doesn't fundamentally change the final image, it doesn't deserve your attention. If you found this video helpful, consider subscribing to the channel. I am Shantanu and I'll see you in the next one.